I'm Ari Heinrich. I'm in the Chinese Studies Department. A moody Sydney weather evening. It's pretty nice out there, but it wasn't earlier. I'm Ari Heinrich. I'm in the Chinese Studies Department as a future fellow and affiliated with the China Studies Center here. It is my pleasure and privilege to take a few minutes to introduce the poet Yang Lian and the translator Mabel Lee. After my introduction, the event proper will begin with a conversation between the two, and then Mabel Lee will read from English translations of Yang's poems, and Yang Lian will read his own poetry after that, and there will be a Q&A session that will start around 7 o'clock. At that time, I'll ask people who have questions to make a line off to the side there, and we'll hopefully address as many as we can. Eventually, as I said, Yang Lian will read poetry in Chinese, and I wanted to point out that literary modernists might argue that the written word is a red herring, and that 50% of poetry has nothing to do with words at all. So I encourage you to enjoy the sound of Yang Lian's voice and the music of the language, whether you speak Chinese or not. I promise that on some level you will still understand much of what is being said. Yang Lian, as you may know from his bio, which was published with this event, was one of the leading members of a group of Beijing poets who later became known as the misty, or obscure poets, the Menglong Shiren. These poets established the seminal literary journal called Today, or Jintian, in 1978, essentially inaugurating the first new wave poetry in post-Mao China. In literary terms, the journal caused shockwaves and was eventually shut down, especially with the events at Tiananmen in 1989. Many members of this group were forced to live abroad. When Yang Lian's Chinese citizenship was revoked, he was offered refugee status in New Zealand and eventually became a citizen there, and he now lives in London. But he's joining us as part of the Adelaide Writers' Festival as well. So today, we can understand that Yang Lian is not only a seasoned poet, but a seasoned exile. And naturally, the two identities inform one another. Far from diluting his authenticity as a Chinese poet, Yang Lian's exile places him horizontally in the lineage not only of his modernist contemporaries, but vertically in conversation with Chinese poets across time who have written about the visceral experience of love and loss in exile. For Yang Lian, as for these other poets, to write in exile is no mere symbolic act. It's political, of course, but it's also corporeal. The act of writing is an act of survival. It's a record of existence and of the rending of the self and the body, or the self from the body. So it's not accidental that Yang Lian's poems are infused with a powerful sensuality, a robust sexuality, and at times a glittering and furious violence. This kind of poetry can get you arrested. In 1983, when Yang Lian was still living in China, a warrant was issued for his arrest as part of a political campaign to purge so-called spiritual pollution, when he wrote a poem of towering macho, named after the virile god of a Tibetan waterfall. Yang Lian's work is often dark and muscular, infused with a Nietzschean brawn and brio. It can be erotic and slippery. Viewpoints can shift suddenly and powerfully, as in his 2009 poem, Island Number 2, in which he writes, "You're right in life's chamber music. Either listen with total attention or else switch off. Water, one drop, can perfectly lock up these shores. The crash of waves has no gap, is like a tailored body, still sitting on the rock. The lilac-scented surrounding ocean, still striking at a little girl's unceasing gaze into distance." Even in that fragment, you can hear the voice toggle from a directive invoking the readerly you when he says, "You're right, either listen with total attention or switch off," to the insertion of a kind of proxy for the reader in the form of the little girl who's gazing into the distance. Who is she, and what are we looking at through her eyes? Perhaps more importantly for this evening, how to translate this poetry of exile, sensuality, and identity to English-speaking audiences. I am happy to report that we are in good hands. Mabel Lee is adjunct professor of Chinese studies at the University of Sydney, following a 34-year teaching and research career in 20th century Chinese intellectual history and literature. Since 1990, she has translated 3 volumes of poetry by Yang Lian and 5 volumes of fiction and criticism by the Nobel laureate Gao Xingjian. She has also published numerous research papers on both authors. Mabel Lee is currently translating a volume of poetry by the award-winning novelist Hong Ying, and is also compiling a book of essays on selected artists who began painting careers in China and later relocated to other countries. Worlds away, the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish once wrote, "History makes fun of its victims and its heroes. This sea is mine, this moist air is mine, and my name is mine. But as for me, I am not mine, I am not mine, I am not mine." Perhaps in some way, the act of translation, and particularly the act of translating poetry, which often is impossible to translate even within its own language, is an act of dissociation. Perhaps the act of translation risks mirroring the original impossibility of transcribing the profound corporeality of exile. Perhaps the price of translating work like Yang Lian's is the possibility that the poet will become even further separated from himself, making him, like Mahmoud Darwish, no longer his own. Yet here with these 2 speakers tonight, I believe we are as close as we will ever come to the utopian potential of translation to create a living union and a conversation in which Yang Lian can become simultaneousاللy both his own and our own poet. So please join me now in welcoming first Mabel Lee, and then after that, Yang Lian himself. Thank you very much.
I think the microphone is on. Thank you, Ari. Well, this is a wonderful get-together for Yang Lian. Adelaide Festival brought him to Australia, and we managed to get him here for 2 nights. But it's because we've known each other for so long, it seems like coming home. How did I meet Yang Lian? It was 1988. He was brought out here by the Australian Foreign Affairs to encourage cultural exchange. Arts Council.
Arts Council, Australian Arts Council.
And people said, "Do you want to meet this art poet, Yang Lian?" I said, "No, I'm not interested." He was in Canberra at the time. I said, I'm only interested in dead poets, not live ones. Anyway, it was John Tranter and Lynn, this Australian poet John Tranter, who said, "I'm inviting Yang Lian for dinner, but I can't speak Chinese. Will you come and interpret?" And I agreed to it. And I met this man. I got trouble. But the interesting thing was, there was no need for an interpreter because John and he somehow managed to communicate all night. I don't know how, but they did. So it's a happy time for you to come back?
Absolutely. This is a great feeling, actually. Also, almost when I sit here with Mabel, with John, Lin, Myron, Bruce, ASEAN, so many friends, almost like recollect the whole world and life of mine and back. And that's something very beautiful. But like Mabel says, all these things are almost secretly linked together. And then this structure has been built beautifully, you know. And well, in Adelaide Festival yesterday, when I started my talk, I did say that, well, this Australia is the beginning point of my international journey, but it was totally unexpected. And because I came here with the fault of Nick Juice, who works in Australian embassy to Beijing, and he was responsible for the China and Australia Writers Exchange Program. But he felt, why should I bring those boring Chinese official writers to Australia? So he secretly replaced me to who knows which Chinese writer. So that's why I was here. And this was why I was in Canberra and meet John and start this poets meeting, but without language. and this is great, which is after all those times, I find I traveled now so many countries. I've been translated into so many languages. I myself also trying to translate it in order to know the poets in different languages. And that is the feeling, actually, what's the meaning of home? The home is not China. The home is not anywhere. I have a home in London, I have a home in Berlin, I have a home, I can go anywhere and making a place. But the home is the poetry, is the deep depths of understanding situated in poetry. And so that is something, I think it's been built before I learned my Younglish.
Oh, your Younglish,
so that
yes.
is, let's say I open mouth to speak my Younglish. Well, this is the I learned this here in Australia. My school of this international poetry meeting is start here. And this is why Mabel and I, when we prepared this reading, and we said, okay, which poem we should read first? I said, 1989? Yes, that's the one poem actually changed my life, changed my writing deeply. But then we thought, no, that's not deep enough. And then we went further and to find this poem in this long poem E, which Mabel translate heroically. This poem is really almost impossible to be translated, but Mabel did, and seems so good. And this very particular poem we are going to read is titled in English, Returning Home. But in this very place, I think, Returning Home, there was a poem I wrote shortly, only a few days, I think, before I came to Australia in 1988. But you will listen the last line of that poem. Actually, that is almost was unable to go back and have returned home, something like that. But anyway, that time I wrote that poems to maybe imagine my way to return China. But all the way my journey since then, there's no meaning of so-called returning China. We also talk about this, where we can return, yeah? But again, to read these poems here, that is to return the beginning of this poet's understanding of poetry, and this is also the layer of returning home. I think this is why that poem really works well here.
Do you think we should read that poem now and then talk a bit more about something else?
I follow your decision.
Okay, let's do it. Seeing he's talked about it, this is the book. Translating it wasn't that hard. Finding a publisher took over 10 years. That was after Tiananmen, and publishers didn't want to touch anything to do with China. Returning home. We hesitate on entering the mirror. Outside the discarded body, even lingering warmth everywhere fails to dispel the chill. We hesitate outside. As the sick person finally removes the face flushed by death's radiance, like ash discussing fire. But the fire is more like winter than the world roasted by it. Thick root and a yellow trap, death has limitless patience. Hesitates with us, awaits our return, lets shadows reveal a dark realm. Night in broad daylight, scene of non-persons with names, lovers or corpses struggle in bed. In an instant, see the self as a deep abyss. Again inside, we let a savage claw savage all persons into a bloody mess. All non-persons, when unable to return, have arrived home.
Okay. 还乡，我们徘徊在走进镜子时丢弃的身体外面，到处余温也不能解除寒冷。我们徘徊在病人最后摘下的回光返照的脸色外面，像灰烬谈论着火，而火比被他烘烤的世界更像冬天。粗大的根，一个黄色陷阱，死亡有无限的耐心，跟着我们徘徊，等候我们归来，让影子提示一片黑暗领地，那白昼的夜，有姓名的无人风景。床上挣扎的情侣或死者，一瞬间看见自己就是深渊，我们在我们外面，又在里面，听任一只凶猛的爪子把所有人抓得鲜血淋漓，所有无人回不去时，回到故乡。Well, I have to say that when I wrote these poems, I was so young.
Yeah,
Unbelievable. And I must try pretend to be old. But I was only 32, something like that, 33. Shortly before I came here, I was 33. And now look back. Wow, my God. As I said in Adelaide yesterday, I feel I am a ghost. And I quite often recycle this word of reincarnation.
Well, you're into I'm not into reincarnation just yet, but it's very nice to see you reincarnated in Sydney.
Who knows in which world?
So, okay, but you were in Sydney, then you went on to Auckland University.
Yeah.
And you were a lecturer.
That was when the Tiananmen 1989
And Tiananmen happened.
Yeah.
And there you were stuck.
Not only stuck, that was my decision too. You know, of course, my books was banned, destroyed in China, but
it was only banned and destroyed because you publicly criticized the Chinese government. This is a book that was just published when Tiananmen happened and you went public. And so they confiscated this and destroyed all the copies of this book.
You get a real antique.
Yeah.
Maybe collectible.
Yes.
Well,
so,
it's true.
But then afterwards, you didn't stay in New Zealand all that long, but you did have some adventures. You did have to make a living.
Yeah, but more challenging question than how to survive the life, to live, is how to continue to write. And not just trying to fighting for life and doing something, but as a poet and as a, let's say, somehow feeling we are whatever we are, but we are still deeply inside of this profound cultural transformations. So how to continue write poetry, how try my best do not repeat myself, but continue to be creative, deepen and develop the writing. That's driven me almost from one place, but to the world. Whatever I know or just feel that, but I need to meet so many people as deep as possible, and that is the way, you know, so-called returning home means to travel as far as possible.
Fair enough. So when did you actually go to London? Was it 91?
Actually, after that Tiananmen massacre, then I came to Australia time to time. Yeah. And Macquarie University was here.
You stayed here for a long time and you were teaching at Sydney University. And I remember you going down to the staff club and getting a glass of red wine, taking it upstairs and charming the students. You wouldn't be able to do that anymore. It would be absolutely impossible. But there was a time when you and your wife were staying in our house. I just moved there, and I think you were sleeping on top of boxes of books. Anyway, but I remember how serious you were about poetry. In the morning, we didn't see him. His door would be locked, he would be writing poetry, and he would only emerge much later in the day. So he's a serious poet. Of course, serious. It's like...
But the poetry is always keep all different, almost opposite natures. On one side, totally serious, but every line poetry also a game. You have to play. So that's always mix up the different natures. But I have to say that I did use this word of reincarnations because with so many worlds we experienced. The world of Cultural Revolution, the world of Tiananmen Massacre, now after that, the world of 9/11, and then the world of so-called globalization, but what's mean of that? And so yes, as a ghost, we experience so many layers of life. So in that case, yes, the seriousness is necessary, I think.
Yes, in any case, I think I published the first 2 books of yours in English in 1990. One in the University of Sydney East Asian series, this one, Master and Crocodile, and this one, The Dead in Exile, it was published in Canberra by Tiananmen Publications. And then I had completed this book, E, but it took, as I said, 12 years to find a publisher. In the interim, Yang Lian had introduced me to Gao Xingjian and had started his novel. And I also was appointed head of Asian Studies, and I just didn't have time to do anything. But Yang Lian went on to discover, or the translator Brian Holton discovered you somewhere in the world, Scotland or somewhere, and he went on, he's done about half a dozen of your books, I think. I've got 2 of them here. There was another one.
Again, in Sydney, I completed this sequence where the sea stands still, and Mabel also translated that into English, and we made the first reading in the university. Yeah. I have to say that that was 1993, before I went to America and then Germany and then London. But with that sequence, it was the turning point from this very darkness of exile, but to find out, like the last line of the poem, of the sequence, this sure is where we see ourselves sit sail. And all these journeys, external travel and journey or exile, it was part of our internal journey. And that sequence, especially when I reached that very ending, is not only find the structure of the poems, I have to say that find the structure of my life. And since that sentence, I knew I can go on. But before that, it was very, very confused. I don't really know, and I didn't find which way to do it. Yeah.
But after you got to London, you started going to lots and lots of poetry festivals, joining Rotterdam Poetry International, meeting all these international poets. And it wasn't that long afterwards that you won the Flaiano Prize in Italy. But there was an Italian translation, apart from the English translation, there was, I think, an Italian translation of your poetry came out very early.
Well, somehow Italian, they like me.
The Italians like him. So he won the Flaiano Poetry Prize. It was the first big one. It was 1999.
Yeah.
And that's the prize that Seamus Heaney won a few years before, and Derek Walcott won.
Yeah, that's Nonino. That's 2012.
No, Nonino's later.
Yeah, 2012.
That's the second one.
Flaiano is before.
It was 1999.
99. Yeah, that was 19.
So it's, you know, top international prize, but the Italians, they like you. Nonino, you won 2012?
2012.
2000, yeah. And then you've got this wonderful fellowship from the German government now.
Wissenschaftskollege, yeah. Well, of course.
So you've got international recognition. People know you, and people in Australia certainly know you. You've been here to the Sydney Writers' Festival a couple of times at least.
Many of them. Yeah.
Anyway, you're doing quite well, and you're able to fulfill your creative dreams.
But on one side, of course, all those international events were important, and especially among all those voices on the works, if there is a clear voice from the contemporary Chinese poetry, it's very important, because we are in this very special situation. On one side, of course, politically, many people knows the difficult problems in China, especially with the so-called Cold War ideology or context that is easy to say something, but also easy to simplify the things. But again, with our great poetry tradition behind of us, and this is one poet, I think, is the meeting point between the very deep tradition, and especially if you look the tradition, it was a greatly individual figures inside of that tradition, all the way back to the very first name of the whole Chinese poetry tradition, Qu Yuan, and he was the one which today we're still using his words to translate the word of exile. But in Chinese, Liu Wang, I have to say that it's somehow so much richer than only the word of exile. Because Liu Wang made up of these two characters, Liu, floating, Wang, death. And floating is death, floating to death, or, which I like mostly, floating from the death. That is the poetry. And in that case, I think one individual figure or poet, we could link the profound cultural transformations and building up the good exchange with the international individuals. And that is what the charming side of this kind of life. Maybe we should read one or two poems.
Yeah, why not?
Otherwise.
Okay. This one?
Anniversary Snow. Okay, yeah. This is a poem, well, a little bit love poem, but a little bit, it's of course, when I grew up in Beijing, and mainly I live in the north side of the planet, and snow is a very homesick stuff. But again, with quite many private background, and snow also remind a lot of so beautiful things. And this poem is something link all this together. It's called Anniversary Snow. Yeah? What was that?
I should tell you that the poems that we're going to read, the next ones, they're all, apart from the last one, all of these poems are translated now by Tao Nai Kan and Tony Prince, formerly from University of Sydney. And they actually have this book, 8 contemporary Chinese poets, that includes quite a few of your poems, fairly recent poems.
Okay.
And they are working on these poems that we're about to read are not published in Chinese yet, are they?
This poem is among the very new poems,
Yeah,
very
all of
last
these are.
part.
All of these are new.
Yes, those
Unpublished.
we are reading the poems that will be published in the book in maybe 2 months, so it's an unborn baby.
Yeah, but it's at the printers, so it's just taking a few more
So
days.
if you don't like it, that means I'm very bad now.
Okay, this is called Anniversary Snow. The earlier dimness takes shape as what looks just like you, but is not you behind the winter sun. The whiteness that collapses ever more urgently increasingly resembles the museum's marble steps, steps that you cannot walk down. 2 gardens tumble neatly together into a thicket of shrubs, the bosom of a girl frozen red. Anniversary. The street lights register every snowflake that goes to and fro, swirling fingertips that jab at you and scorch you. Placed with the elegant precision of a conductor, 2 exhaled breaths hang suspended in the air. Each is a book that the other can never read to the end, but you hold it. While leaning against the sound of meltwater that oozes from the marble and drowns the museum, a frozen red earlobe has made a date with the twilight, waiting everywhere, a planet carved from coldness. The howling wind recognizes you standing there motionless and drifting down, tender hexagonal signatures. Keep a firm grip on the secret plumpness of the girl's shoulders you need not walk down. The brightness that spatters the stone statues is rising, just as though you imagined skeleton. Just as though your imagined skeleton, had been crushed to bits by tiny hands full of ashes. Little witches commemorate nothing, but only give graceful birth again to an icy coldness exactly like beauty itself.
Okay. 周年之雪，更早的幽暗，形成于酷似你，又不是你的冬日后面，更急切坍塌的白，更像博物馆的大理石台阶，你走不下来的台阶。2座花园齐齐跌入一丛灌木，一个冻红女孩的怀抱。周年，路灯注册每片经过的雪，返回的雪，纷飞的指尖儿戳中你，烫伤你。指挥家那么窈窕的地点上，2次鼻息都悬浮在空中。彼此是一本读不完的书，你拿着倚着大理石渗出的淹没博物馆的融雪声，一枚冻红的耳垂预约了暮色无所不在的等，一颗寒冷雕刻的星球，风声哭嚎着认出你，主力也在飘落，60形的嫩嫩签名按住女孩隐秘浑圆的肩头，你无需走下，石像们击剑的皎洁正升上来，酷似想象中你的骸骨，被捧着灰烬的小手一点点搓碎。小女巫什么也不纪念，只袅袅再分娩一次，凛冽的恰似美本身。
So, with Yang Lian's readings, you can tell how it's musical, how each word is chosen very carefully, and this is the beauty of his poetry. When he first asked me to translate his poems, I said, I'm not a translator. I said, I only translate dead poets' poetry. Anyway, he said, please, I need it for my readings. And these are very short poems that I've written in Australia, and I need to, how many? You said they're just a few lines. And I read them, and I could hear the sound in them, and I agreed to it. And that started me on the track of translating. But it was only because I felt that I could hear the music, the sound in it, that I agreed to it. So that was your poetry that grabbed me, not
That's
you.
very kind of you. But it's not only me, but I think this is a very, very charming, of course, but also a little bit mystery part of this Chinese language, which is, we talk about this quite often, the Chinese characters, there are layers inside of each character. Visual layers, which is come very quickly into your eyes, the musical layers, which is hidden behind of the visual images, and the musical layer, not only sound, but also tones. So these two elements compose the whole energy and the law of music. And back to the classical poetry, all this Du Fu and those classical forms has been not only composed, but also fixed by law to, for the poets. If you choose a nice character, but with the wrong tune, sorry, you got a red card. Out. So that is very cruel, but on the other side, this is a great challenge to the poet. You are not like today. If we read some, we can write some Chinese characters. I said, oh, I can write poetry. But in the old days and everywhere, poetry is a high professional thing. The skill, the technique, whatever you say, your high concept, it has to be proved by the very elegant writing. So the form is extremely important. Without the form, no poetry. So in this case, I will have to say that I've been forced by my father read some poems when I was 7, 8 years old, and that time I hate poetry. I simply hate it. But when I start my own writing, when all these poems which I read by heart come back to judge my language, and not allowed me to write those poems without certain energy, inside of the music. And so that was why I think you heard when you said very nicely about my reading all my poems, but that was not mine. There was so many great ghosts behind me, which is not allowed me to write cheap newspaper quality stuff. And this is a point. But the next poem, so we talk about that to read is in Chinese called Ye Cao Tang. Cao Tang is a Du Fu Cao Tang in Chengdu. There was now of course a park, but of course the house was rebuilt later. But they said that the site was a Du Fu where he was there about 1,200 years ago. But to me, in the whole history, except Quyuan, 2,300 years ago, Du Fu was the master to write about exile experience, but in the extremely exquisite form. And I was in Cao Tang in 1981. when I was in my prehistory time. And, but there was a great moment, enlightened me, and then made me almost immediately got the idea of the 7 long poems which I composed later. That was my first time, let's say, open the domain of my poetry. But in 2011, exactly 30 years later, I have another chance to be in Chengdu, and deliberately chose to enter Caotang at about 5:30, when all tourists left the living place, leaving the site, and suddenly it's back to quiet place, and I walk alone and recite Du Fu's poems in my heart, and thought about my own life, and I feel I was not only been writing into the Chinese tradition, the great individual Chinese tradition, but been also living in there. And so this was why afterwards I thought, well, I must write something, because now not only Du Fu or Yang Lian, now Du Fu is Yang Lian. So I wrote this Ye Cao Tang. Yeah. Shall we read it?
Yes. This comes in 2 parts.
Yeah.
So I'll read part 1, and then Yang Lian will continue.
Yeah.
So the translated title is Homage to the Thatched Cottage. 30 years walking from one side of summer to the other. 30 years brewing the hues of autumn. A cupful of stronger, unstrained liquor is placed before me, an upside-down reflection of swallowed smiles. The scent of gardenia is stitching up the cracks in the twilight. The thatched cottage resembles a thatched boat as I listen to the sound of my own waters, which flow past but fail to flow beyond the diameter of the sighing of the deep green pool. My breath as I stroll on brushes against the bamboo leaves, counting the light raindrops that fall into my fear of death's uncleanliness. 30 years ago, a child turned around and left the whirlpool behind. This too was the flower-lined path. This too was the wicker door. He boarded the boat that carried poets to their own separate ends, painfully scraping the bed of this 1,300-year-old river. Light as a straw, left to the cutting of winds and gales, he never flinched before poverty and illness, but wrote inscriptions for others as his conclusions. The millstones he pushed grind the smoke from the kitchen chimney. Drifting faintly away, my maturity is like a nation familiar with the beauty of grief.
What's the English translator, the title of that?
Homage to the Thatched Cottage.
Okay. 夜草堂一，30年，从夏天这边走到那边，30年，酝酿着秋色，一杯更浓的浊酒。移至我面前，倒映咽下的笑。栀子香仍在缝合裂开的薄幕，草堂像草船，听我自己的水声，流过，却未流出绿茵茵的深潭叹息的直径。 我漫步的鼻息，佛滴竹叶，数着落入死亡洁癖的我的疏语。30年，孩子转身丢下漩涡，又是花径，又是蓬门。登上诗人各自绝命的船，刮腾此地1300岁的河底，轻如一根草，任凭狂风搂克的，不拒绝贫病提赠的结局。他推过的石磨，沫子炊烟，淡淡飘散。我的成熟，像一个国度，习惯了忧伤之美。
This is part 2 of the poem. The dim corridor of a line gets darker as it goes on, a line of verse. The garden is quiet and the tourists have dispersed. The walking sticks of the bamboo grove count the sounds of wind, rain, birds. The washed flowers on the hills are like people fresh from their bath. Give me a twilight that oozes the yellowing paper of 30 years of waiting, and 2 faces pushed far apart by 2 stretches of water. 2 faces, a wooden bed with a cold quilt, catching up with the swallows, a space of hidden fragrance that constantly withdraws, until implied meanings shine out of neglected flesh and blood that has wasted or drained away. Give me a destiny that is different from any other road, one that turns them all into shadows. He walks slowly on, while raindrops as big as wine cups pour down beside me. The clouds grow blacker. The flame of a candle looks far away from deep under the water. A single summer reads out the chill of 1,000 summers. Give me this ability to forget poetry and return at last to piercing warmth, a death more surprising than language, is affronted by a life that is not worth living but becomes mere empty words, while the sea on whose fringes I trod cautiously is very close to his thin frame. I forgot to pay homage at this thatched cottage, and it took me 30 years to build a thatched cottage bit by bit from scraps. One line of a poem that never ends exhausts all the meanings of the word wandering. A history that has no broken walls or crumbling battlements. When the lamplights of 1,000 homes are at worship in a heart as deep as the night, I pick out tender, moist flower buds that have all sprouted at the same time. Give me a dazzling red, the incense that remains within the body, burns, perfuming this moment. The flickering stars germinate. Now I am the one who was old and handsome and pure enough.
2，一行诗的幽暗甬道，越走越暗。一行诗，缘尽游人散。竹林的竹杖点着风声、雨声。含义给我一种命，不同于每一条路，却把路都变成影子。它慢慢行走，在我身边掷落酒杯大的雨滴，云欲漆黑，一点烛火从水底远眺，一个夏天读出1000个夏天的含义。给我这能力，忘记诗歌， 才终于返回刺骨的温馨。比语言更惊人的死，被不值得的活冒犯成一句空话，而我小心踩过边缘的大。Thank you very much. Yeah. So before I came to Australia, and we read the very new poems, which you can see what's the growing and whatever good or bad, and then we come back to the beginning. They were clever enough, and they played in a kind of a concert hall, and they switch off all lights, and suddenly we are in the pitch black darkness, and suddenly a kind of a ghost crying came from very, very deep time and place. And I was so shocked by the power of this silent music. And then I learned there was a shun. And in my home, I have several shun. And every time when my computer getting so slow, I take one and start to play, and computer getting quicker. And this one is actually almost like to record that feeling when the first time I heard that. So the title in Chinese, the 熏至黑暗中的听者, to the listener in the dark.
Yep.
Yeah, that was the title. But link with what we read about Du Fu, this poem is really carefully designed the rhyme. There was a rhyme, I don't know in English translation.
Probably not.
Well, you see, that is the thing. I do think if the translation is, I'm sorry, it's good or not good, whatever. It's not only the fault of translator. It's also the fault of original poems, because the original demanding should be set up in the original works, and therefore question and challenging the translator, and therefore making good translation and exchange. If an original poem has no demanding, translator can do whatever they like. They are free. But if original poems has demanding and very clear, then the translator has to face to the challenge.
Well,
so,
I think they worked very hard on it together, and I edited these poems, but they would fight for whatever they would say.
Fight more.
So anyway, I was quite happy with, particularly both of these ones.
Okay.
So they've translated it as Xun to the listeners in the dark, as he explained. There is no beginning. The stage is prehistory. It retreats into the imagination, then further to the hot lips. A kiss covers the earthenware mouth. 6,000 years. A single long phrase caresses the lovesick lungs. Silken lights, shimmering, draw the wild goose's cry back out of your chest and rehearse the only night a Xun has. A ghost sings softly from afar, and you sit in the dark, deep in the wilderness, and hear a fresh tenderness that cannot retreat any farther. The ghostly dialect is slowly drawn out from one note to the next. How many people has it obliterated? Obliterating the flow of water. It is surrounded by a solitude of water and protects the starry sky. A Xun takes in a mouthful of scorching heat from the flesh and blood in the grave pits, and blows coldly, steeping you in the purity of your own secret darkness, a secret passion. All elegies are love songs. The small sum that stretches up in the dark prods the clouds into motion. Your skeletal whispering exhales a cosy warmth. Listen, the soul story of firing clay and giving you shape, the whimper of apprenticeship, the remote beauty of your body, a single hole again leaves you drenched. As a tiny Saturn spins, its rings of light are shattered. Tonight, hearing's magnetic field lines seize on private matters. No need for words of sorrow or joy. With a kiss, the notes bid a fond farewell. In the darkness, rare black flowers thrive, and there floats, for a second, a compelling brilliance. Poetry turns listeners into singers, and through it, your breath emerges into birth, enters into death. An earthenware gift handed down through time. You are here, a spring breeze in the heart. Mouth to mouth, love sips the greenness of the wilderness, while colourlessness twists the blades of grass into silence, where echoes overflow, rippling on and on endlessly. In the dark, a lovesick melody, inch by inch, engraves your sole existence, the only lingering music.
Great. Well, this one is especially and deliberately made music. So the 4 stanzas, each one, the rhyme like the A, B, A, B, A, B, and then C, C. And then the second stanza, again, but different, but A, B, A, B, A, B, C, C. All those C, C are the same rhyme. But A, B, A, B in different stanzas are different. So I hope you recognize that, but if not, that's okay. 熏是黑暗中的听者，没有开始，舞台是一个史前，退到想象里，再退到热热的唇上，吻。 堵着陶土的嘴6000年，一个长句揉搓相思肺，丝光闪闪抽回你怀里的艳明，排演一支熏仅有的一夜，鬼远远低声唱。黑暗中你坐着，旷野那么深。 听一种无处可退的鲜嫩，鬼悠悠的方言从这一声到下一声，抹掉了多少人？抹水之动作，用水之孤独围着护着那星空，一支熏浸满墓穴下血肉的灼热，冷冷吹。 你沁尽自己阴的纯净，殷殷恋着挽歌，都是情歌。黑暗中，翘起的小拇指拨动云，你残骸般耳语，偶着温馨。听啊！ 烧制成形的仅有的故事，呜咽着实习你身上那远方之美。一只孔洞还给你一次淋湿，而小小的土星旋转，光环粉碎。今夜，听觉的磁力线都含着隐私，何必言悲欢？当音符最热中吻别。 黑暗中，黑暗的奇花欣欣浮动，1秒钟璀璨逼人。 诗意，令听者如歌者，令你的鼻息出生入死，一件陶土的礼物递过时间，你在此，春风在心里，嘴对嘴的性爱泯染旷野之绿，而那无色的捻着草尖儿，令沉寂溢出回声，那漾开没有结束。黑暗中，一曲相思一寸寸，镂刻仅有的你，仅有的余音。Thank you.
Do
you want to try one?
One more.
Last one?
Last one.
Okay, back to beginning. Yeah. So this is a book I showed in the Adelaide Festival. I said, look this book, The Dead in Exile, and that's not important. But published by Tiananmen Publications, which is perhaps this publisher published only one book.
Yeah.
It's unique publisher for the unique book. And but I'm very, very proud about this book because, well, this contains also the piece written by Gu Cheng and me called In Memory of the Dead at the very night of the 5th of June. We wrote overnight and immediately translated into English. And the facts, that time we had most, the totally updated thing was the facts everywhere in the world. Yeah, so whatever, anyway, to me, and I think to many friends here, this Tiananmen, it's word we cannot forget, and it's marked our life. If you are interested, I can tell you a little bit more story about much more important link with Tiananmen, how the changes happen in East Europe, in Russia, and because of Tiananmen. But we have not that much time, so we read poetry first.
Yes.
And this poem we are going to read is the Book of Exile.
Yes.
And the poem was written in Sydney. And the first sentence was directly gained from Mabel's home when there was something decadent happened. And well, but after all those years, I still think the poem is function for me. And it's marked at that time, but mark also my life now. And so that.
Marks of this pen just written are swept off by a wild wind. Emptiness, like a dead bird, soars across your face. Funereal moon is a broken hand, turning back your days, back to the page when you do not exist. In writing, you bask in your own deletion. Like another's voice, bits of bones are spat carelessly into a corner. Hollow sound of water brushing water carelessly enters breathing, enters a pair, and ceases to look at others. Skulls all over the ground are you. In words and lines you grow old in a night. Your poetry invisibly traversing the world.
流亡之书，你不在这里，这笔记刚刚写下就被一阵狂风卷走，空白如死鸟在你脸上飞翔。送葬的月亮，一只断手，把你的日子向回翻动，翻到你缺席的那一页，你一边书写。一边欣赏自己被删去，像别人的声音， 碎骨头随随便便脆到角落里，水和水摩擦的空洞声音，随随便便一入呼吸，一入一只梨，就不看别人，一地头颅都是你，在字里行间一夜衰老。你的诗隐身穿过世界。OK? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to hear you both read. We actually have a few minutes, probably about 15 minutes altogether, to entertain questions to both speakers. If I could trouble you to make your way down to that side of the stage near the microphone and take the opportunity to ask direct questions. This is your moment. If you don't mind. If you could come down. Yes, thank you.
Wow.
Oh, yeah,
Okay, and about 15 years ago, and I met you either in Edinburgh or Glasgow, and I'm very glad to see you again, and here in Sydney. And it's good to see you to be alive. I quoted Yuhua's novel's title, 活着. It's good to see you. And we're talking about life and death, and I would like to ask you a question about, and it is said that poetry in contemporary China is dead. 诗已经死了 in contemporary China. And do you have any comments on this? And I think that you may keep yourself informed and what's going on there and about the poetry and there. Thank you very much.
Well, even poets is still alive. How can poetry die? Almost you said, oh, wow, the chicken is here. How can have no eggs? But there was quite often people talk about how the poetry becoming bordered or something in China or something like that. But entirely wrong. I tell you the truth because there was. I highly recommend you to check out this website. It's called artsbj.com. In Chinese, it's a Beijing 文艺网. Simply go to the internet and look at that. And there was a private website owned by a painter friend, and asked me to be an artist, so-called director. And I said, why not? But what should we do? He said, you can do whatever you like. And then with a few friends, we said, okay, let's make an online poetry prize, open to everyone. All poems written in Chinese, but the committee and the juries are not only Chinese, highly international, and but no one, together with other juries like Xi Chuan, Zhai Yongming, Tang Xiaodu, all those friends, no one expected within 1 year 80,000 poems flooded into the website. We said, what we can do with this? And then looking carefully, at least 10% of poems were really good. From our experience, we know that the poets have been long past their so-called exercise or prehistory period. That means they've been writing for really quite long, but not even interested to send to so-called official magazines or something. They wrote for themselves, exchanged between themselves, but with this website, then maybe also with our names or whatever, they sent to us. And even more moving, many poets came from the very bottom of the Chinese society, the cheap laborers. The real cheap laborers which come from countryside, works in the factory with extremely low paid, but in the night when others sleep, they wrote poetry. And with a little computer, they have their window to their spiritual or dreaming world. And well, if you're Chinese, maybe you know this factory called Fushikang. And I don't remember the English name, but anyway, this is a big factory owned by Taiwanese, produced the things for iPhone, and famous in China because there was 13 workers jumped the building, commit suicide because of the very bad treatment to them. And one of the great cheap labor poets who sent poems to our website wrote this the poem about the worker who has been sent to fix the net. Normally we call the safety net to carry someone accidentally fallen, but this net is to try to carry those deliberately jump down. But this poet won the prize, and when I gave the written words to him, I said, how fine of the net can carry the fate of those workers. Therefore, he wrote poetry, and he wrote wonderful poem. No slogan, no cheap stuff, highly individual and creative, language beautifully. And so he won one of the most important prize, the prize of the first collection. Not only one poem, but whole book. And the book will be published, and he got also some money. And now he's becoming a quite international figure. But this is only one case. And now second year started, and you can see that already something 40, 50,000 poems are there. And so this is, we never thought maybe that like Mabel's translation, which no one think there was a so hard job like that. But poetry is there. The commercial surface of China cannot cover the real energy of poetry, because poetry is not working with that commercial surface at all. It's working with yourself. Be yourself, answer the question which you cannot find from the easy place like newspaper or theories or whatever. Poetry is discover where the question is. What is the question? So that is the, I think when everywhere, the more questions happen, the more important poetry is. So I think, well, at least I hope poetry is dead, because too many poems have been sent to our.
Excellent. Let's jump on the opportunity to add in 2 more questions, perhaps. I think someone who was just jumping up here, this woman in the front, sorry, and you, and then hopefully we'll fit in a third. Thanks.
It's so exciting to hear your poem, I have to say. I just want to know, from your perspective, making a poem in a free format, not going according to traditional Chinese rules and 5 words, or 7 words. What is? I feel the difference because I'm learning the traditional way. I just want to see what do you feel?
That's a very good question, because our so-called generation, and also as well as the other contemporary Chinese poets, let's say. We start poetry writing all the way since the end of the Cultural Revolution, but actually that takes quite a long time to pay the real attention on like forms. Quite a long time there was writing the so-called free verse or something. Partly because of this great pressure come from the classical poetry. The form was so perfect based on the nature of characters. So how to create a contemporary form which is good enough, with the challenge of classic. This is nightmare of contemporary Chinese poet. But again, all nightmares are great inspiration too. So after all, I have to say that right now, more and more poets paid huge attention on those individual created forms. Like for example, like this the poem, they are not like a classical poetry which we all play the same football. They are the referee. They are the rules. You can kick out by the red card or yellow cards. But we have to invent form for each poem or maybe each collections. But that means there is no form. So the idea of form had been built very clearly, awareness of form. If you get a chance, I and an English poet, W.N. Herbert, maybe John heard, English and Scottish poet, we spent more than 4 years and edited a big anthology of contemporary Chinese poetry in English translation and published by Blood Axe in 2012, titled Jade Ladder. It's very easy to find it. And that book, one of the special nature is it's not simply the poems listed under the name of poet, but the whole book separated by 6 sections based on 6 different forms. Lyrics, narrative poems, sequence with structure, long poems, no need to expand, neoclassical poems, deliberately on how to transform the classical form into contemporary, and experimental poems. So those, by this way, to point this awareness about form. And then you can see how colorful the poets trying to find their own form for their works. Yeah.
Thank you. Why don't we take one more question, and then I'll ask the other person, perhaps informally, as soon as we wrap up, you can just come on up and ask, and we'll engage.
We'll get. I'll go ahead. Yeah. Actually, I have 2 questions, but I'll keep one. I want to ask the one I'm very curious. You are the only person I know who know Gu Cheng personally. Of course, Gu Cheng is a very controversial figure, and he's very talented. And people call it, he's a murderer, he's a rapist, or whatever. Because I'm very curious, give some opinion about, your own feelings, opinions about him.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
You could just simply go to the online website. They made a big program on the 20th anniversary of Gu Cheng's death.
Yeah.
And I said something there. Yeah. There's one thing, but basically, remember Gu Cheng and Xie Ye, they died in 1993. Yeah. And as I say, when I wrote the sequence where the sea stands still, the same year. And that was actually the darkest moment of our exile. Because 4 years after Tiananmen, and the road to go back to China and becoming quite hopeless, but the journey in the West is endless. And Yanglish was that little, Gu Cheng maybe 0. And so this is very very challenging time. So Gu Cheng's tragedy is really, to me, is hugely mixed up between the historical tragedy and the personal tragedy. And so, of course, there are, finally sad things happen. But sometimes when people been pushed to certain corner, and that's very, very difficult. This was why, in, again, the book of Jade Lada, I looked quite many the books of Gu Cheng in English translation, including the book published New Directions, the famous publisher, but they did not including the last sequence, the very last sequence Gu Cheng wrote, in Chinese title, 鬼进城, Ghost enter the city. Cheng, but his own name. So this sequence made up the structure of Monday, Tuesday, all the way to Sunday, 7 pieces. The language explosion. And there was really something very typical to represent that explosion or falling parts of life, but also the fallen parts of the writing. So for Jade Lada, I couldn't help but commissioned a wonderful translator to translate the poems into English and publish it. And because without this piece, you will only think his things could be a love story or a Hollywood story or whatever, that kind of thing, or Cold War ideology stories. Too simple. Okay. And this one is, I highly recommend you to read that poem.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and thank you so much, Lian and Mabel Lee, for this amazing presentation. Very great.
Thank you.
We have to formally conclude our program, but please feel free to come and chat. Thank you very much.